Hi guys, welcome back. We're now going to be covering our second last learning unit for Raymond Carver and his short stories. Let me quickly share my screen. Um, and what we are going to be discussing now is the analysis, or rather, analyze the narration and narrative structure of the prescribed short stories using narratological theory and textual examples. So, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about how the narrative plays out, and I'm going to be referring very specifically to how the narrative is quite different due to which story you're looking at and how it is portrayed through specific perspectives. So, first thing I want to talk about is what is a perspective or what is a point of view. And we have three generally in the way that we engage with perspectives. The first is first person, I, me, my, sometimes us or we. And this is a very specific tool that is used, and we will see that you guys will see, is depending on which short story you're reading, there are several that are using the first person perspective. The second is second person perspective, and this is unusual. Second person perspective is a very unusual narration technique. There's a few experiments recently in it, some more popular than others, some more successful than others. And as you can see, I'm referring to one of the most popular and most really iconic at the moment is the Caroline Kepnes novel, which was turned into the series, which narrates the whole story to you, and it is in the second person. So it's talking about you did this, you did this, you did that, which is, and we're going to talk about why that is so different. And then your third person, which will either use characters' names, saying Claire did the following, or um, Mahatla did the following activities, whatever. Or sometimes they will just replace those names with pronouns, being he, she, they, or them. So what is the point of each of these? And I'd like you to take a minute, think about this. Why do we use a specific perspective? And I want you to think about this in two perspectives, or two respects rather. I want you to think about what does it do for us as the readers when we are reading something from a perspective? What does it mean when we read something from the I perspective versus the he, she, or character's name perspective? And what does it mean when the author is using this perspective? Do they have a specific intention that they are trying to communicate to us when they're using this perspective? So take a minute to think about that and keep it in mind for what we're going to talk about next. So hopefully you took a minute to think about that. But what I want to talk about is briefly, because it is not a genre that is very often used, but it does have a very specific point. What I want you to think about is, why is second perspective or second person narration so disconcerting? And the reason why I'm doing this is to really give you an idea that there is an intention behind every author's choice. So I'm going to read to you the opening lines of You by Caroline Kepnes. And just to make it even more disconcerting, what I'd suggest you do is, I've got a YouTube video at the bottom there, and I'd like you to click on it and watch it, because what it is it's the creepiest moments of Joe Goldberg, and it's from the Netflix series, but most of it has been very faithfully adapted. So go watch that and watch his narration and his speaking to her. So I'm gonna read this to you, and I'm hoping you're gonna understand exactly why this book was so unusual. You walk into the bookstore and you keep your hand on the door to make sure it doesn't slam. You smile, embarrassed to be a nice girl, and your nails are bare and your V-neck sweater is beige, and it's impossible to know if you're wearing a bra. But I don't think that you are. You're so clean that you're dirty, and you murmur your first word to me, hello, when most people would just pass by. But not you in your loose pink jeans, a pink spun from Charlotte's Web. And where did you come from? You are classic and compact. My own little Natalie Portman, circa the end of the movie Closer, when she's fresh faced and done with the bad British guys and going home to America. You've come home to me, delivered at last on a Tuesday. This should make you uncomfortable. If you are a girl listening to this, you should feel uncomfortable about just how much he is sexualizing her within the first paragraph. And if you are a guy, you should be sitting there thinking, why is he thinking about her like this? And how much of it you should notice is really commodifying her, classifying her by a specific set of identities and appearances that are very specifically linked to desires and dreams that he obviously has rather than actuality. He's declaring who he thinks she is from the very first paragraph without her being able to say, "Oh, actually, no, I'm not that person. You're making up who I am." Um, and that should be disconcerting. So, second person, when we look at it as a narrative technique, is meant to make you feel uncomfortable because it feels like the author is talking to you as the reader. It feels like that fourth wall, which takes the that protects us from the or separates us from the action in the book, has been broken. And instead of it being just addressed to anyone, this is addressed to every woman who is reading it. And it is making every man who is reading it Joe, if we're going by heteronormative standards. So what I'd like you to do for a second is to sit for a minute and think about, okay, that's what second person does. What does first and third person? What does a first person perspective allow us to do, and what does a third person perspective allow us to do? I've kind of already given you the answers for second person. And then I want you to think about, what does the reader experience when they're reading this? So, what do you think the author intends when he uses these perspectives versus what do you think the reader experiences when they're reading through these different perspectives? So go on and take a few minutes to do that, and then we will discuss it. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break down what the aim of the narrator is and what the point of having a perspective is, particularly in reference to the Raymond Carver short stories. Now, this is a super useful little chart, which I've stolen from VC Learn. So please, if you are interested and you'd like to use it, it's not only on the slide, but it is on your VC Learn page. It's a very useful little diagram which you can use to classify narrators. Um, and it will help us to sort of compartmentalize how we break down and differentiate between first and third person narrators and how we view them as different. So the first thing that we're going to do is the first decision is, are they a character in the story or are they not a character in the story? So this is usually the differentiation between the I voice, which is always going to be in here, or the name of the character, or he, she, they, which is under this side. So your first person perspectives are all going to be main characters or characters in the story, whereas your the narrators that are not characters are going to be your third person narrator. We then split off when we are looking at, is the narrator character, into, are they the main character or are they not the main character? So the first one is, if they are the main character, then it is called a first person protagonist. And I'm going to go through this in more depth and explain this when we're looking at different short stories just now. The next thing, if we say no to that, is, are they a minor character or are they just simply witnessing the events? So this is quite important to differentiate between. We need to be able to differentiate between whether they are a minor character that is simply along for the ride and they are therefore an observer, or if they are not related to the events at all, but they're kind of just witnessing what is happening and they are therefore a witness. And what this does is, this differentiation is quite nuanced. So we'll discuss this in a little bit more depth just now. If we say no to, are they a character in the story, we then get to think about, how much does the character, or how much is the narrator capable of telling us what the thoughts of the characters are? And what I want you to think about as a sort of clue here is, are we following one character at a time? Are we following two characters at a time? Or are we following many characters at a time? Or are we following no characters at a time? So here, this is broken up just into three. If we're following no specific character and we're just watching the events, we are in third person objective. This is very difficult, and this is not something you're going to see very often, because a lot of stories are told through the eyes of a character, and therefore it's difficult to write a series of events separated from the character. A lot of the time, this is how writing becomes also very dry to read. If we're following one specific character and we're getting a very specific view of those characters' thoughts, we can hear inside their head, we can see what they're feeling, we can kind of experience it third hand from them, then we are witnessing this as a third person with limited omniscience. What omniscience means is omniscience is the ability to understand or have full knowledge of everything. In other words, when it is limited, we can know a lot about one character, but we might have absolutely no idea about any of the other characters in the story. And then lastly, if we can view the situation from many different characters' perspectives, so we can sort of hop and follow different characters around, and we can kind of peek inside their head and see what they are feeling or thinking, then it is likely that they are going to be third person omniscient. And we are following many different characters and their way of experiencing things. So a little hint here is that third person limited. Harry Potter does this, where we follow Harry around all the time, and we're always with him, even though we're hearing Harry did this, Harry did this, Harry did that. Whereas third person with many would be Game of Thrones, where every chapter we're jumping from one character to another, and we can kind of live through their experiences. Okay, so let's break that down a little bit further. And I'm going to say here, as I've said already, we need to keep in mind how much insight does our narrator have into the minds of the characters? How much can they see what is going on in the head of a character? And that is what's going to differentiate between a an omniscient narrator or an observer narrator and a witness. So the three things that we have here is an omniscient narrator is going to know everything. They will know what has come before, they will know what is coming next, they will know the motivations of a character, they will know the opinions, they will know the feelings, they will be able to very clearly discern everything about what's happening in a story. And these narrators, they're actually usually quite easy to follow stories. But a genre that will almost never have this is, for example, a mystery novel. You will not have a mystery novel where the narrator is omniscient, because the whole point is we're supposed to uncover the mystery with the narrator. Though there is a change to that if you're interested. So Peter Swanson's book, Eight Perfect Murders, or Eight Rules for Perfect Murder, or Rules for Perfect Murder. I can't remember the title exactly because there's a British title and an American title. The main character, who's our narrator, knows everything, but he's only revealing certain things to us in different points. An observer, for by contrast, is usually a minor character. They will be involved with the action, but they're not center, which means they are not the protagonist. The main things are not happening to them. They are just sort of around, and they might be in some way or form sort of involved with it. And then lastly, a witness. These characters are very distant from the events. They're just watching it pass them by. And sometimes what they are do is they are actually retelling something that they've watched to us, something that they personally might not have experienced, but they might be retelling a story to us. And just as a hint, you could probably use this as to kind of harken back to your second year. Think about Heart of Darkness. This would be a witness narration. Okay, so what does a first person narrator allow us to do? Now, this is the question I asked you just now with the activity. A first person perspective allows us to experience events firsthand. And if that is trauma, if that is joy, if that is fear, if that is celebration, it is much more close. It is much nearer. And we are able to experience and completely immerse ourselves in the narrative perspective of that character. So, in the case of So Much Water, So Close to Home, we experience everything through Claire's eyes very directly and very clearly. We are at no point distance from her experiencing the trauma of these events. We are seeing everything very much in our face and very much in this moment. And it's quite heart stopping to see the realizations that she's having along with her. First person perspective often will make things very personal. Um, and this also allows us to sort of remember that stories are not told in sequential events, because if you're with a first person narrator, a lot of the time they will retell things through their own interests, through what happened that was important, through things that were classified as interesting in that moment and not just all of the events in perfect chronological order, which is why we see Claire's panic attacks, we see her moments of fragmented memories, we see her flashbacks and her storytelling in a very disorientating and disorganized manner, because it makes it seem more real to us as how her brain is working. So, just a couple of hints here. What I wanted to do is classify examples of these. So, in first person protagonist, this is when obviously our main character, the things that are happening to them, and we are experiencing it as such. So, the stories, they're not the only ones, but these are the ones that I think are best examples that experience this are intimacy and so much water so close to home. A first person observer, sometimes they're a minor character. They have some interaction, but not necessarily they're hugely involved. And I've chosen vitamins as this because most of the things that happen to the characters of Patty, Donna, and Sheila. They are the real protagonists of the story. And in fact, Patty and Donna are the protagonists of the story. Our narrator is sort of kind of just there. And then lastly, a first person witness who's a character, but he's kind of just around. He's not really involved in anything. And this is a great example of this is Where I'm Calling From. Now, by contrast, what does a third person narrator do? So a third person narrator allows us to have a little bit of distance between the immediate experience of what the characters are doing and how we are experiencing it. So the immediacy tends to be removed. What it also allows us to do a lot of the time is it allows there to be a layer of critique of either the events or the characters. Um, and what happens is another example of this is it allows us to critique or challenge or question the way characters are behaving. And a good example of this sort of occurs in Where I'm Calling From, because this is a first person narrator, but we're experiencing a second-hand story. And so what we have is we have this distance between ourselves and the actual events at times. And therefore we are seeing the narrative through someone else's eyes once removed. And therefore we can judge the characters in the story. We can judge the events. We can judge the things that people are doing and saying to one another. Now, third person point of views. A third person omniscience will have the perspective of they know everything. And in the case of interior thoughts and characters, this will mean that they know everything. They know what's happened, they know what's coming, they know what's going to happen next. And there are no characters that are omniscient in any of the short stories that we're going through. The next is third person limited. And this is when we are following one person's perspective throughout the stories. We are experiencing one character and we are seeing their experience of a moment. And this happens quite clearly in a serious talk, and we see this in Are These Actual Miles? And lastly, third person objective. And this is when we are having a narrator and they are able to see nothing into the interior of different characters' perspectives, but we are able to perceive how the characters are behaving and we see their actions, but not necessarily their interior thoughts. And a small good thing uses this in a very experimental capacity. Okay, I've got a couple of defining and useful sources for you guys to use, and that is going to be us for this learning outcome. And I will see you in the last video next.